In the middle of the dusty main street of a small town, Tala stood with her belongings scattered at her feet. Harlan Graves, the man who had ordered a mail-order bride 3 months earlier, pointed at her in front of dozens of townspeople gathered nearby. His voice echoed through the street, dripping with contempt. "See? I told you all. She is far too wild. She is half Apache. I wanted a wife who would be obedient and take care of the home, not some wild animal." Snickers and whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Too wild. No man could ever control her. That is what happens with a mail-order bride. Tala stood with her shoulders slightly hunched. Her long black hair was tied neatly behind her head, and her eyes were filled with quiet sadness. She wore an old dress, covered in dust from the long journey. Her hands tightened into fists, but she did not cry. Apache people did not cry so easily. Harlan lifted his chin. "Buy her a train ticket home. I do not need her." The crowd nodded in agreement. At that moment, a low, calm voice cut through the suffocating tension. "Good. I like wild." Everyone turned. A tall man stepped forward from the edge of the street. He wore an old cotton shirt, a weathered Stetson hat, and dusty leather boots. His face was rugged and angular, with a light beard along his jaw. His steel-gray eyes locked directly onto Harlan. Racher Kane, the rancher who lived alone in the high hills to the north, a place where even the toughest gunmen rarely dared to go. He stopped a few feet away from Tala, glanced at her briefly, then turned back to Harlan. "A real man does not buy a wife the way he buys a horse, then try to return her in the middle of town, if you do not want her." A slow, sharp smile spread across Racher's face. "Then I do." The entire street fell silent. Harlan's face turned red. "You? Who do you think you are?" "Racher Kane," he answered simply. "And I do not like seeing women bullied." He bent down and picked up Tala's worn leather bag, then looked directly into her eyes. "Do you want to come with me?" Tala studied him for a long moment. There was caution in her eyes, but there was something else as well, surprise, and the faintest spark of hope. She nodded. Racher said nothing more. He slung her luggage over his shoulder and turned to walk away. Tala followed him down the silent street, where the stillness felt almost suffocating. As the two of them left town, the whispers rose again like a flock of noisy birds. "Racher Kane has brought trouble home again. She is Apache. Those two will end up killing each other. She is too wild for any man." But Racher Kane only smiled to himself beneath the harsh, unforgiving sun, as though he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. "Hey, friend. It's great to see you today. If this story takes you back to the old days, please subscribe to the channel so we can meet again." Kane did not say much on the ride back to the ranch. He rode a gray Appaloosa horse, leading Tala along a winding trail that climbed into the dry, rugged hills. The Arizona sun poured down on the valley like molten fire, making the air shimmer with heat. Tala rode behind him on the pack horse carrying their supplies, sitting upright and silent. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was already sinking toward the western horizon. Racha's cabin sat at the base of a hill, simple but sturdy. It was built from rough pine logs, topped with a clay tile roof, with a small yard and a horse corral beside it. Beyond the cabin stretched a vast valley, now covered only with brittle yellow grass shriveled by drought. "This is my home," Racher said as he dismounted. "It is not fancy, but it is a lot more dependable than that town." Tala looked around. There were no women, no children, just one man, living alone in a harsh and unforgiving land. "How long can I stay?" she asked, her voice low and steady. Racher removed the saddle without looking at her. "Until the drought ends, or until you decide you want to leave." That night, they sat beside a small fire on the porch. Tala made Apache corn cakes with her own hands, while Racher simmered a pot of dried beans and jerky. The silence between them was real, but it was never uncomfortable. The days that followed were filled with the kind of silence that comes from working side by side. The drought made everything harder. The well behind the ranch had dwindled to little more than thick mud. Racher's small herd of cattle had grown thin, their eyes sunken from thirst. Tala refused to sit idle. Drawing on the knowledge of her Apache heritage, she guided Racher into the hills to search for underground water. Together they dug a second well, and her hands became rough and calloused from breaking the hard earth. Racher never said thank you. Instead, he quietly hauled water back to the livestock, then returned to repair parts of the cabin roof that had been damaged by relentless heat and dry winds. Tala climbed onto the roof beside him, passing nails and boards while sweat streamed down both of their faces. "Apache women handle the heat better than I expected," Racher said, his voice rough from the dry air. Tala wiped the sweat from her forehead and offered a faint smile. "And you, Cowboy, are much better at staying quiet than I expected. Most men talk a lot when they are trying to keep a woman around." Racher paused with his hammer for a moment, then chuckled softly. It was a rare smile, but a genuine one. "I do not keep anyone. If you want to stay, stay. If you want to leave, leave." Tala studied him carefully. "Are you not worried about what people say? They call me too wild. A mixed-blood Apache. Dangerous." Racher drove another nail into the roof, his voice calm. "People used to say I was crazy for living alone on a hill. It never bothered me." He looked up at her, his gray eyes shaded beneath the brim of his hat. "Wild is not a bad thing, Tala. It just is not something everyone is brave enough to handle." The days continued to pass, and they kept working together. Tala gathered medicinal herbs to treat wounds and fevers among the livestock. Racher taught her how to throw a lasso and manage what remained of the herd. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Sometimes Tala spoke about life before, about her tribe and the green cornfields that had flourished before drought and war arrived. Racher spoke about his late father and the reason he had chosen a solitary life after witnessing too much death on the prairie. They rarely spoke about feelings, yet every small action seemed to say something neither of them could put into words. Racher repaired the wooden bed in the corner of the cabin for Tala. Tala quietly mended his torn shirts with stronger thread while he was not paying attention. One scorching afternoon, as they guided the cattle back toward the corral, Tala teased him. "You live like a she-bear. You hardly talk, you are always grumbling, and your cabin is always dark." Racher glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting. "And you are like a wild wind. Everywhere you go, you stir everything up." Tala laughed. The sound was bright, strong, and clear as it echoed across the drought-stricken valley. Racher watched her for a long moment before shaking his head and smiling to himself. He was beginning to realize that ever since the day he brought Tala home, the cabin had not felt cold or empty anymore. The drought showed no mercy. The days that followed were brutally hot. The ground split open with deep cracks, and the dry grass scorched beneath every step. Racher's herd had dwindled to fewer than 10 cattle. Each morning, they had to drive them farther across the land in search of the few remaining water holes. The air was so hot that every breath felt like it burned their throats. Tala and Racher spoke less than ever, but the silence between them had changed. It was the silence of two people fighting against a harsh land together. Then Harlan Graves came back. He arrived at the ranch one sweltering afternoon, with 3 rough-looking hired men riding beside him. Dust swirled through the air as the 4 horses came to a stop. Harlan pointed directly at Tala, his voice sharp and shrill. She belongs to me. I paid for that mail-order bride. She is coming back with me." Racher stepped off the porch with his old Winchester in hand, his voice cold as stone. "She is not property. She chose to stay here." Harlan sneered. "A rancher living alone on a hill with a wild Apache woman? The whole town is talking about it. Some people say you forced yourself on her. Others say she seduced you so she would have somewhere to stay." Tala's hand tightened around the dagger at her hip. Anger flashed in her eyes. Harlan tilted his head toward the three men beside him. They climbed off their horses, their hands drifting toward their guns. The tension in the air stretched as tight as a drawn bowstring. Racher stood perfectly still, but every muscle in his body was ready. "You should leave," he said quietly. "This is not your fight." One of the thugs laughed and drew his revolver. Everything exploded into motion in an instant. Racher surged forward and smashed the butt of his rifle into the first man's face, sending him sprawling backward. The second man fired a shot, but Racher moved just in time and drove a powerful punch into his stomach. Harlan pulled his gun and aimed it at Racher's back. Tala did not hesitate. She grabbed the revolver from Racher's belt and fired a warning shot into the air. The gunshot echoed across the valley. "Do not even think about it." Harlan spun around, his face twisted with rage. "You filthy Apache." Racher seized the moment and landed a crushing punch to Harlan's jaw, knocking him flat onto the ground. The remaining two men decided they had seen enough. They grabbed their injured companion and hurried away. Harlan struggled back to his feet, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth as he pointed a trembling finger toward them. "You will regret this. The whole town will turn against you." He climbed back onto his horse and rode away in a cloud of dust. Racher stood there breathing hard. Blood dripped from a wound on his arm onto the dry ground below. Tala rushed to him and tore a strip from her dress to make a temporary bandage. "You are hurt," she said, worry filling her voice. Racher looked at her and managed a faint smile. "I will be fine. Just a few scratches." That night, the fire inside the cabin flickered softly. Tala sat beside Racher, cleaning the wound on his arm with medicinal herbs. Outside, the dry wind continued to howl through the mountain passes. Racher watched her quietly. "You did not have to do that today." Tala looked up. Firelight danced in her eyes. "I am not a bird in a cage, Racher Kane. I chose to stay here, and I will fight for this place." Racher was silent for a long time. Then he reached out and gently placed his rough hand over hers. "Then we will fight for it together." That night, the fire in the cabin's stone hearth burned low. Racher sat against the wooden wall, his left arm carefully bandaged by Tala. A small amount of blood still seeped through, staining the cloth dark red. Outside, the drought wind continued to whistle through the mountain passes, carrying the distant howls of wolves across the night. Tala crouched beside him, cleaning the wound with warm water mixed with medicinal herbs. Her hands were steady and skilled, but worry lingered in her eyes. "You should not have charged in like that," she said softly. "Three men at once." Racher smirked, his voice rough. "If I had not, they would have shot me in the back." Harlan is not the kind of man who fights fair. Silence settled between them for a moment. Only the crackling fire and the wind outside filled the room. Tala set the cloth aside and looked directly into his eyes. The firelight illuminated her face, highlighting the strong features of her Apache heritage. "Why did you do it, Racher Kane?" Racher held her gaze for a long moment. The steel-gray eyes that had once seemed so calm now carried something deeper. "Because I could not let him take you away." He drew a slow breath, as if searching for the right words. "When I first brought you here, I thought I was simply doing what was right. But as time passed, I realized it was more than that. I do not want you to leave. Tala remained silent. Racher continued, his voice growing lower. I have lived alone for too long. I got used to the silence, used to not needing anyone. But you changed everything. You are not afraid of drought, hardship, or hard work. You never waited for me to say pretty words. You were simply there, working beside me, standing beside me. He glanced down at the wound on his arm. I am not the best man. I am rough around the edges. I do not talk much. And this ranch is far from wealthy. But if you will give me the chance, I would like you to stay. Not because of the drought, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because staying is what you truly want. Tala placed her hand over his. For the first time, she reached for him on her own. Harlan said I was too wild, she whispered. The town says the same thing. They fear me. They fear the Apache blood in me. They fear that I will never be the kind of obedient wife they expect. She looked straight into Racher's eyes. But you are not afraid. You said, good, I like wild. And every day since then, you have proven it. You never tried to change me. You allowed me to be myself. Her voice trembled slightly, yet remained steady. I do not want to go back. I do not want a husband who buys me with money. I want a man who respects me. A man willing to stand up for me, and willing to sit here and say the difficult things you are saying now. Racher gently tightened his grip on her hand. Tala, she smiled, a rare smile that seemed to glow in the firelight. I choose you, Kane, not because I have no other choice, but because you are the first person who ever made me feel free. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the drought wind still swept across the land, but inside the cabin, the air felt strangely warm. Racher lifted his uninjured hand and gently touched her cheek. His fingers were rough from years of work, yet surprisingly tender. Then stay with me. Tala tilted her head slightly, resting her cheek against his hand. I have belonged here for a long time already. That year, the drought finally released its grip on the red earth. 1 year after Harlan Graves had been driven away, the first raindrops fell across the Arizona Valley. The rain was light, but it was enough to soften the cracked, thirsty ground. Tiny green shoots began pushing their way through the soil. On the porch of the cabin, Racher Kane stood behind Tala with his arms wrapped around her. His hands rested gently across her stomach, where their first child was growing. Tala leaned back against her husband's shoulder, her long black hair falling down her back. Do you remember the first day? She asked softly. Racher chuckled, resting his chin against her hair. Of course. You were standing in the middle of that street, covered in dust, angry at the world, and more beautiful than anything I had ever seen. Tala laughed, the bright sound carrying through the gentle rain. And you said, good. I like wild. Racher tightened his embrace. The best thing I ever said. They had married 8 months earlier, in a simple ceremony held right in front of the cabin. There had been only a few close friends and a traveling preacher. No extravagant wedding dress, no grand celebration, only honest vows and the warmth of the hearth as their witness. Tala remained exactly who she had always been, strong, untamed, and free. She taught Racher how to find water by reading the signs of nature passed down through Apache traditions. Racher taught her how to break wild horses and manage the ranch. They still argued from time to time about repairing fences, about whether Tala should be resting more during her pregnancy, but those disagreements always ended with laughter and an embrace. The rain grew softer. Racher gently turned Tala toward him and looked into her eyes. Tala Kane, he said, his voice warm and steady. "Thank you for choosing to stay. Thank you for teaching me that wild is not something dangerous. It is something worth protecting." Tala reached up and brushed her fingers across his face, tracing the small scar on his cheek from the fight the year before. "And thank you," she replied, "for being brave enough to love a woman the whole town said was too wild." Racher leaned down and kissed her, a deep and tender kiss beneath the misty rain. When they finally pulled apart, his gray eyes shimmered with happiness. "Good. I like wild." Tala burst out laughing, her voice echoing across the valley that was finally coming back to life. She pulled him closer and whispered into his ear, "And I like cowboys who know exactly the right thing to say, at exactly the right moment." Together, they stood on the porch, watching the rain fall over the once parched valley. The land was healing. The cattle were healthy again, and within Tala, a new life was growing, the living bond between two people who had once been the loneliest souls in this corner of the world. The rain continued to fall. The wooden cabin remained warm. Some love stories do not begin with roses and sweet declarations. They begin with a public rejection in the middle of a dusty street, with loneliness on a drought-stricken land, and with a simple yet powerful sentence: "Good. I like wild." The story of Tala and Racher reminds us that in a world often afraid of what is different, the people who embrace the untamed parts of another person are the ones who truly see their worth. Tala was never the kind of woman who fit the town's expectations. She was fire. She was wind. She was the fierce spirit of her Apache heritage. Many people feared that. Racher simply smiled and said he liked wild. They loved each other through quiet actions. They repaired roofs beneath the blazing sun. They searched for water for their livestock. They stood together when others tried to take away their freedom. Their love was built on deep respect, the strongest foundation any relationship can have. Where are you listening to this story from today? Let me know your country or city in the comments below. Reading your comments always brings me joy and inspires me to keep writing and sharing new stories. If you enjoy warm, slow-burn stories about genuine love and human connection, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss future stories. Thank you for spending part of your day with me and joining me on this storytelling journey. Sometimes, all we need is one person willing to say, "Good. I like wild," and willing to stay beside us through both droughts and storms. I hope all of you find peace, happiness, and people who appreciate the wild and beautiful parts of who you are. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all the very best.